had a spontaneous experience as far as something related to psi? And can you guys stand up? If you've ever had an experience, just stand up, because I want you guys to look at each other and really see each other. If you've ever had a spontaneous experience yourself. I'm sure there's a few more people that are just being lazy, but that's okay, you can sit down. So I had an identical twin sister, and so she was also born on that planet. Oops. Thanks. Okay, I thought that was a pointer. I won't use a pointer. Okay, so we had lots of experiences together, telepathy, communication in dreams. And when we were about 12 years old, we lived a couple hours away from the Theosophical Society in Wheaton, Illinois. And my sister somehow got a library membership from there where we would get materials sent to us. I have no idea how she did that at the age of 12, but so we started to read all kinds of theosophical material, which we couldn't understand, and I still basically can't understand it. But it got us really interested in meditation, and we really wanted to learn how could we control our abilities. But whatever we read, it would just say to meditate. And it would say, well, you can meditate, but that's not really the point of meditation. And so it was a little bit frustrating, and like probably many of you, sometimes we'd have experiences and get really into this stuff, and other times life would take us in other directions. So I ended up going to the planet of academia, got my bachelor's in psychology, master's in social work, and got a job as a federal probation officer. And that was very stressful, and I ended up taking some meditation classes on the planet of clairvoyant reading and healing. And that was a very interesting planet. It was actually the Berkeley Psychic Institute. Has anyone heard of the Berkeley Psychic Institute? Have you graduated from there? Well, it was an interesting place, and the thing that blew my mind was that there were so many people who could really seem to really be able to read other people, get very accurate information about them. Now, the focus wasn't on mediumship, and I've known many people throughout the years who were from the planet of mediumship, but this was different. This was different practices, even though it involved reading people. So some of our practices, unlike mediums where a lot of times they'll stand up in front of a group of people and do what's called cold readings, we would sit there with our eyes closed and try to not get information ahead of time. Not that all mediums do that, but we use different practices, and we really weren't focused on trying to connect with spirits, even though that oftentimes would happen after a while. If you tune into a person, into their energy field, if there happens to be some kind of being or spirit around them, or what seems to be some kind of presence, that will come up. So I was very involved in that. I went through a 13-month clairvoyant training program. And then I went through a whole bunch of changes and ended up leaving my job as a probation officer, moved to the Philippines, where I went to Planet Healing for a year or so, working with the different healers out there. Then I came back and I became a professional psychic. I wrote a few books on the subject of clairvoyant reading and healing, so I really stayed on that planet for a while. I started the International School of Clairvoyance and taught these techniques I had learned at the school. Well, around that time, this was about 25 years ago, I was reading Russell Targ's books, everything I could about remote viewing. And even though most of my focus at the time was training people how to read other people, I would do these experiments in remote viewing. And I started working with people over the phone, which produced some really interesting results because we weren't physically together. So I could do things like have an object, and I noticed some very interesting patterns. If I just said, okay, describe this object, maybe they wouldn't be describing it. But then if I moved it, they would suddenly see it. And at first I didn't really notice I was doing this, but they're like, oh yeah, I see this like stuffed animal with these big eyes, and it's moving all around. And I was like, well, it's not. And then I realized I was moving it. So I started to move the objects, and it seemed like every time I did that, they would notice it. So I noticed some other things too, like one time a student was talking, he was doing a very good job describing this painting I had on my wall, but that was behind glass. But he started to talk about this door and a reflection of a door. And I was like, well, he's really getting off track here because there's no reflection of a door. And so about 2 days later, I was sitting in the office in a different chair, and I looked at the painting, and sure enough, you could see the reflection of a door in the painting. So this told me something, that he wasn't just reading my mind, because at that point I wasn't sure, is this just telepathy? But he had been actually describing something that I hadn't been seeing myself. And I didn't sometimes I would take pictures and send them to the people, but in those days we really weren't over the internet too much. So he didn't even get that feedback photo like most of my students would get now. So one other interesting experience that was I had a beautiful bowl of strawberries, a basket of strawberries, a green basket, and the student had done a really great job of describing the basket, describing something red in there, all these characteristics, and then suddenly they started to get really freaked out and really scared. And they said, this is dangerous, and this could really kill someone. And I was like, okay, they're getting off. That's too bad, because they were doing really well. So I stopped the session, and I said, calm down, don't worry. It's just a basket of strawberries. I picked them myself. And they said, oh, well, that explains it. I'm allergic to strawberries. So this really taught me that remote viewers' experiences or their perceptions and their descriptions so much come from what their own experience is. This also started to clue me into the problems in judging and rating descriptions, because if somebody put that down on a piece of paper, a beautiful basket of strawberries are dangerous, a judge would mark that as wrong. So that got me really interested. I wanted to know, well, can these things be repeated? And can I set this up in more of a formal way? But I knew I didn't know enough about remote viewing, and sure enough, I just kind of put it out there to the universe. I want to learn more, and I was contacted very soon after by some researchers who wanted to learn remote viewing themselves, a medical doctor and a plant biologist, and they also wanted to know, could remote viewers describe microscopic organisms? And so we got together and did all these experiments, and we ended up training ourselves and also getting into research. We won a remote viewing award through the International Remote Viewing Association. The medical doctor ended up getting removed from the project due to some problems he was having. And this was really my introduction to research, because I was pretty much stuck on this project, having no idea what I was doing. And it took 5 years. We had been given a $2,000 grant, and so even though we were putting in probably hundreds of hours, because we had 50 remote viewers who did 2 different sessions on a bacteriophage, and basically open response choice format, and then these had to be rated by virologists that we had to recruit. So this was a tremendously difficult project, but we learned a lot from it. And so part of my point here is I went over to the remote viewing planet, and then I went over to the world of parapsychology when I started to present this work. And then I also got invited to be a research subject. So I ended up going to Planet Parapsychology and going to a couple different states here. And so I did some projects with Ed May and Dick Bierman. I did a project with Stanley Krippner, James Spottiswoode, and a few others. And I learned a lot. And one of the things that I really learned was that people don't tend to travel between these planets. They tend to stay there. And they have some very particular ideas about the other people that live on these, and very closed ideas. I also learned that a lot of the parapsychologists had tended to travel to one particular planet or a couple, but not the others. And so their research was very much informed by where they had visited. And some of their research was really a little bit wacky, and that's what I'd like to talk about as we move forward. I also wanted to talk about a couple models here. I'd say the outdated model is that psi is anomalous, or even that it's exceptional. I know right now exceptional is the new buzzword, but I still don't like it, because I sincerely believe that everybody is psychic, everyone has this potential, and it's just a matter of education and training. For example, how many of you have ever felt somebody else's emotion or pain or body sensation? If you feel like you've ever done that in your life at least once. Okay, a majority of people are raising their hands. And how many of you know several other people who do that? Where, you might have a pain in your head and turns out it's your friend who's having a really bad headache, or you suddenly, I've had this happen where suddenly my hand, goes into extraordinary pain, and I know it was fine a second before, so I'm like, what's going on? And then sure enough, somebody walks in with a bleeding hand. This is really pretty normal. The thing is, so many people in our society don't realize that it's normal, so they don't even ask the question, could this be coming from outside myself? So again, the reason this is important is because there's ideas. For example, one of the big things is that a lot of people and then researchers think that psi is spontaneous and it happens just instantly. Well, a lot of times that's very true, but you can actually control it in a way where you can direct your attention and have moment after moment after moment of instantaneous experiences. Okay, and just want to skip over here. So I want to talk about remote viewing and training. Some of you may have noticed a lack of research in remote viewing. Now, over the last 20 years, has anyone noticed that there's a real lack in the literature of remote viewing? And what's going on here? Now, when I use the term remote viewing, most of you are aware that comes out of the Stanford Research Institute's work and the military programs where they train psychics to use their psychic abilities. So there's a lot of talk still about the grand old days at SRI and in the military, but there's really very little talk about what's going on today in remote viewing. And I'd like to say there's a couple of people here who've been very involved, Simeon Hine, who you'll meet tomorrow, and then John Noble, who wrote the book Natural Remote Viewing. And we have other people here who I've seen at the remote viewing conferences. And one of the main components is that people are trained. And not just trained, but the philosophy behind, because remote viewing came out of the military and SRI, people, even brand new students, are trained under the idea that when you are using your psychic abilities to describe something, a physical location or an object, that you should work blind. Blind means that you're given a target number, some indicator, but you have no idea what it is that you're describing. Sometimes you might know it's a location or you might know it's an object, but sometimes you don't even know that. And so people in this field are just immediately taught to work in really a pretty scientific way. So I did a little survey here. I had 117 respondents, and basically we asked, have you received any remote viewing training at all? And 100 out of the 118 said yes. And then we asked, has your performance improved? And as you can see here, 12 felt a little bit, 29 felt a lot, 40 felt tremendously, and 10 said, I can't tell. So a lot of people feel that training helps. And I'm standing here to say that even though I'd already been trained in another psychic discipline, I didn't really know how to guide myself around a location or how to do more than get the initial bit of information. Or what if I got some information and half the time it's right on and the other half it's completely off? What do you do then? Are you just stuck with having these possibly wrong perceptions? No, there's things you can do to direct your attention to get the right information. And I know I don't have a lot of time, so this was from our bacteriophage project, and see we had a couple. This is a remote viewer sketch. I'm just going to skip over this real quick. So oftentimes remote viewing involves in-depth sessions, and these can sometimes take hours long. So it's not just an immediate impression, it's hours of guiding yourself around a target location. And this is important because I have been coming across so much research where the design calls for just spontaneous acts of, spontaneous reflexes, much like card guessing. And that model is still around. And So I just wanted to show here, this was the I did a project for a year with Dick Bierman and Ed May where I did 45 remote viewing sessions. It's a study that hasn't been published yet, and I'm not sure if it will be. But Ed really likes when you turn in your session to just have like about 10 perceptions or less. And he doesn't, there's this whole long dispute going back to the SRI days about whether or not some of these methodologies developed by Ingo Swann and Hal Pudov work. And so I've been trained in them. I don't always use them, but I like to take my time. So Ed has an idea, well, if you're going to describe a photo, you know, it only needs to take a few minutes. I took about an hour for this session, and then I just took my 20 pages and narrowed them down to just a few words, and that seemed to work out pretty good. But you can see if you're going to get, you know, different parts of a complex structure, you need to work your way around. Well, how do you work your way around? It's very simple. You just, if I said to you guys, what's in the back of the room? Like, could you tell me what's in the back of the room right now? What's on the wall? No, but how could you know that? What would you do? Right, you would turn your head and look. And this is basically what you do in remote viewing sessions. You know, you might, if you want to know what's on the inside, you just need to go to the inside, and you just do this in your imagination. And it really couldn't be easier than that. But sometimes it's easy to forget to do these things. One of the things I wanted to talk about is some of what remote viewers are working on today. And I see I'm so almost out of time here, but one of the problems with remote viewing that we're trying to work out is that there seems to be a mixture of correct and incorrect elements. So this was one of my sessions. I was tasked to describe what caused the Trade Center to collapse. And you can see I got the airplane, but in my mind I had swastikas on it, and I was thinking of really World War II. So that wasn't correct. So how do we deal with that? Well, there's certain things within the training that will help you, but in order to deal with that, you really have to stay in a session for a long time. You have to put aside what you initially got, and you just keep working the session. One of the things I've found is that if I keep going back to the location, and let's say I stay in session for an hour or 2 hours, there's going to be repeating elements, and those elements tend to be more correct. Again, sessions take time, and one of the problems with a lot of research projects is that the researchers are telling the subject how to do the work instead of asking what would be the best way for you guys to do the work. This was another example of a session where I had drawn this arch shape, and this was when I was pretty new, and so this was part of a project for the International Remote Viewing Association where they give you a target and you upload your sessions to their page. John Noble runs the project, and so I ended up uploading my session and looking at the other viewer sessions, and what I noticed was that they all had the same shape. At this, I didn't have this fleshed out, I just had the shape. And so I saw others did too, but they didn't say what it was or have any descriptions around it, except one person said it was a rainbow, and I knew that it was not a rainbow. So what this told me was I had not done a good enough job. I hadn't taken my time to fully explore this. So I went back into session because they hadn't given us our feedback yet, and I brought myself up to the top and said, what's up here? Got people with binoculars. I said, okay, what's down at the bottom? And I found that I was rappelling down. Now that was kind of strange. Why would I be rappelling down? Well, that would tell me you don't rappel out of a building, so this told me that this had to be something outside. And sure enough, it was Ayers Rock, so that turned out to be a pretty good match. But my point here is that it took extra work, extra attention. And I have about probably 100 more hours in my presentation, but what I really want to impress upon is my examples here are pretty typical of remote viewers, and there's hundreds of remote viewers, and they so want to get better, and they're interested in research, and they're interested in working with scientists and researchers. They're being informal researchers themselves, but they need help, and they would just love for somebody to take an interest. And if you have any, I know hundreds of remote viewers, so if any of you need subjects, you want to, I have a program called Adopt a Parapsychologist where I'm trying to pair them together. So please get in touch with me. Thank you.
Which planet are you headed to now?
Well, that's a good question. I just started my going for my PhD at University of West Georgia. So I'll be there for academia for a few years and then hopefully planet vacation after that.
But are you still more or less in the remote viewing sphere?
Yeah. I look at it like I go between two planets. I'm a professional clairvoyant during the day, and then I run my training school. So I teach 4 classes, 15 hours a week, and then I also do remote viewing. Remote viewing is like my extracurricular activities, and then doing research.
So your studies at the university don't relate directly to...
Well, actually, you may know Dr. Christine Simmons-Moore, she was the vice president of the PA Association. She's a parapsychologist, and I just finished an assistantship with her. So she's at the university, and they're actually really open to these subjects. And so I'm going to also, Ingo Swan, who you guys probably personally knew, his archives are at the university, and so I've been working in the archives as well.
Hi.
Hi.
In the group of remote viewers that you're involved with, or you set up, I guess, do you also have out-of-body experiencers, or you just have remote viewers? Because, there's a distinction, right? When you're remote viewing, you have your, visual images and what you have, feelings, inner feelings. But when you're out of body, right, you have an inner vision, right? You don't use your eyes, but you see all around, like 360 degrees, what you call the circle of vision, right? You have tactile and input, you have the olfactory, sensory input, you have... So, and if you do have out-of-body experiencers, how would it compare with the remote viewers, or remote viewing, rather? You know what I mean? We've talked about it before.
Yeah, there's a lot of different theories. Some people believe that they are going out of body. Some people believe that they're extending out. I have found with my students, if I say, let's go out of our bodies and let's fly over here, that works. If you say you're going through a portal over to the location, that works. So it's really through imagination, but even the idea that you can take the location and bring it right to you and interact with it. So it's really however you want to conceptualize it. And we can't, I know Ingo believed that there was, an out-of-body factor, and I would say that's my sense too at times, or if not out of body, there's a dissociation, but we can't prove that.
And just a quick question on sort of a lateral subject on teachability. In the education field, we have good studies now that creativity declines starting around the age of 5, right around when you enter school. So we lose some of our natural sense and talents with creativity. Have you done any work on teachability with children, whether there's gifts that are naturally there, or working with the very young?
Well, I think remote viewing is an ideal thing if you want to help them get in touch with their abilities. That's a perfect thing. I really discourage them from doing things like clairvoyant reading or mediumship or anything until they're way older, because it's basically like doing counseling. And I've just found that even teenagers, like emotionally, they make really bad choices if they're hooked up with people to give them information. So, but playing remote viewing games, having them describe pages in their textbooks and things like that are great things.
You haven't found that it's a gift per se that you find often in youth that later we grow out of?
This is my own thought on this is that people need to be encouraged and educated, and there are some that just naturally are open for a number of different reasons that we don't have time to go into, but my belief is that if we start at a very young age having them play different psychic games, it would make all the difference in the world.